Battambang Fort, the British headquarters of British Malaya, existed from 1909 to 1946 as a British-administered state on the Malay Peninsula. This region included some of the empire's most profitable territories. The military fort on Bukit Battambang, or Battambang Hill, was built in the 1930s and was designed by British engineers. The project was officially designated as the South Straits Artillery Base and was constructed by a group of workers from South Africa, India, Nepal, Gibraltar, and elsewhere. Some were imperial employees, some were prisoners of war. Battambang Fort was designed to protect British shipping routes around the Malay Peninsula, as well as provide military protection for the British Air Base at Butterworth, which was located across the Penang Straits. The fort was staffed by British and Punjabi Indian soldiers. The fort had a particularly fearsome reputation among locals, so in its early years it was nicknamed Punjab Hill. However, once completed, the fort was to last only 5 years. The Japanese began their invasion of Malaya on December 8, 1941. On December 10, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the senior officer of the British High Command in Malaya, issued a stern order. At this time of reckoning, the senior officers call upon all ranks of the Malayan command to make a resolute and continuous effort to defend Malaya and the British territories adjacent to it. The eyes of the Empire are upon us. All our positions in the Far East are at risk. His warnings would be in vain. The fort at Penang was designed to withstand an attack from the sea. Its 2 6-inch cannons were pointed outwards, while the fort's anti-aircraft defenses were not yet complete. Furthermore, most of British power in the Pacific was concentrated around Singapore, so when the Japanese army suddenly launched an air attack on Penang, the British were caught off guard. Brigadier General C.A. Lyon, the garrison commander at Battambang, ordered to evacuate without fighting. On December 15, 1941, most of the British and Commonwealth garrison of Penang withdrew, and the island surrendered to the Japanese. The Japanese occupation of Penang lasted from December 17, 1941 until its eventual surrender in September 1945, and it is during this period in the history of Battambang Fort that the story begins to differ. According to some historians, the Imperial Japanese Army used Penang Fort in much the same way as the British did. The fort was damaged during the British retreat, with both 6-inch guns destroyed to prevent the Japanese from using them. Nevertheless, the fort was repurposed, this time to protect Japanese shipping lanes. According to this story, the fort protected Penang Island until the end of the war, during which time it was abandoned. However, a self-researched account, provided by the Penang War Museum, is quite different. Soon after the Japanese captured the fort, it was converted into a prisoner of war camp. Ritual torture and beheading became routine affairs, and the prisoners were ruled by a particularly ruthless Japanese assassin named Tadashi Suzuki. According to the story, after each killing, Suzuki would wash his samurai sword in a bottle of whiskey. Some say he drank whiskey afterwards. However, both accounts agree that Fort Penang was abandoned after the Japanese emperor surrendered in 1945. All remaining Japanese POWs were sent to Singapore or Kanchanaburi, where the Japanese built the death railway on the Thai-Burmese border, and the fort was left to the mercy of the jungle. The construction of the Penang War Museum would take decades before the fort at Bukit Battambang would be forgotten. Thick green vegetation returned. Waxy leaves and creepers buried old steel and concrete, while the humid, salty air accelerated the deterioration of rusty guns and soggy woodwork. Locals were reluctant to visit the site. The stories of what happened there grew scarier with each passing tale. The place was declared haunted, and over time Bukit Battambang was dubbed Bukit Hantu, or Ghost Hill. It wasn't until 1993 that Johari Shafi, a businessman from the northern Malaysian state of Kedah, came across the site. After visiting war museums overseas, he initiated a project to restore Fort Battambang, and in March 2002, his proposal was approved by the Penang state government. It took 6 months to clear the area. The jungle was cleared, buildings were restored, and many of the exhibits were brought in from other collections. The now-defunct Brunei Times reported that the old fort had been exorcised, and that same year the Penang War Museum was closed. It was finally opened to the public. 20 acres is a large area, and exploring the Penang War Museum can take a whole day. We spent most of the day there, sometimes wandering the unpaved jungle paths, sometimes stopping at bunkers and barracks to read the information on display. Most of the information was accompanied by plastic corpses, ghosts, and garish, creepy execution devices. It was late afternoon when we came across the paintball field, a sparse open space that cascaded down a hillside, where painted tree trunks and rubber poles rose up into a makeshift maze. A gallows had been erected on top of the field, where the gallows met the museum's compound. The gallows were a replica. Ing is a copy of the device that ended the life of General Yamashita, commander of the 25th Japanese Imperial Army in Malaya and Singapore. He was widely credited with victory over the British in the Pacific, but after Japan surrendered, he was tried for war crimes and eventually hanged in the Philippines in 1946. The hangings here feel like an overstatement, as if the museum is stretching itself to include as many gruesome elements as possible in its story. But the hangings are nothing compared to what's seen on street corners. In the courtyard between buildings where a walkway through the jungle connects to a communal area, a wooden giant is restrained, standing on the roof of an outdoor toilet and staring down from a tree with a supernaturally menacing expression. It's not alone, either. In another building, this one is called the torture chamber, a pointing spirit, made of rags and wire, hangs from a rope in a tree. A sign nearby calls these ghosts. Giant mannequins, he explains, are appearing at night during the renovation of this place to create a war museum in 2002, which our workers witnessed. The mannequins are part of a variety of collages at the museum. Some tourists claim to see ghosts, spirits, shadows, or demons, while others claim to see the assassin, Tadashi Suzuki, who roams these paths at night. However, finding reports of ghosts from before the museum was built is becoming increasingly difficult. Before the hill was presented as a dark tourist destination, we followed a quiet path from there, which runs along old buildings. The jungle hissed at the tropical atmosphere around us, and signs on wax trunks read, "Beware of wild animals, snakes, centipedes, scorpions, bats, wild cats, eagles." The buildings at the far end of the complex were mostly used as military camps, divided by rank and ethnicity. One was for British officers, one for other British soldiers, and one for Indian soldiers, with kitchens for cooking food of various religions. There are two very different histories here. Walk past the British hospital, where mannequins sit with bandaged limbs and a plaque detailing the medical facilities available at the fort. Then, just around the corner, a block where a prisoner of war was beheaded was found, with a sign reading guillotine hanging from a tree, with a picture of a pale red drop of blood. Nearby, a panel explains that the famous Japanese assassin Suzuki beheaded a POW here. The Penang War Museum tries hard to live up to its reputation as a haunted place. Plastic ghosts, homemade gallows, skeletons painted on the walls. Near the entrance, they even refer to a National Geographic article that listed it as one of the 10 most haunted places in Asia. These words appear in capital letters, their proudest recommendation. However, in their taste, this attempt at horror is not up to par, and moreover, it worries me how much real history is being obscured by the constant emphasis on ghosts. Real Penang ghosts. When I left the Penang War Museum, I wasn't sure what I had seen. Of course, I didn't see any ghosts there, but more than that, I wondered how much of the information given was real history and how much was just entertainment for the sake of entertainment. At times, it felt like a parody of myself, like a haunted house ride with a Japanese occupation theme. During a series of ethnic massacres known as the Sukching, literally purges through extermination, Japanese forces occupying Singapore and Malay killed thousands of innocent victims, mostly targeting the Chinese population, who were enemies of Japanese rule. Between February and July 1942, As many as 70,000 victims fell victim to the Sukching, although Japanese historians have put the more conservative figure at 5,000. There was also a prisoner of war massacre. In January of that year, Japanese forces in the southern state of Johor captured about 150 retreating Allied soldiers. In what later became known as the Parrot Sulong massacre, the Japanese beat, burned, and ran over bound victims with trucks. Reports indicate that as many as 5,000 people were killed by the Japanese in Penang. However, most of these massacres took place at the police headquarters on Penang Road in Georgetown. There seems to be no evidence of this. To support the claim that a massacre took place on the site of the present-day Penang War Museum, local survivor of the Japanese occupation, James Jeremiah, was interviewed by Malaysian news website Art.age in 2016. "I've seen people being arrested," he told them. "I don't know how they were interrogated. I've heard screams and groans." Jeremiah also mentioned notorious assassin Tadashi Suzuki, but never associated with the fort at Batamang. In fact, other sources put Suzuki across the water, in the mainland town of Butterworth, where he served as police chief and was notorious for brutally beheading prisoners. "The name Suzuki instills a great deal of fear in the locals," said another survivor. Malaysian historian Andrew Huang says Tadashi Suzuki died in April 1945, en route to Japan, on the hospital ship HS Awamaru, which was hit by the submarine USS the American Swordfish attacked on purpose. Huang argues that Suzuki had no business on Penang Island, let alone serving as an executioner at Batamang. Historians challenge the idea that the Japanese ever used the Penang fort. Huang writes elsewhere, "We have interviewed local residents and there are no stories of massacres. The cannons were abandoned and destroyed by the British before the Japanese arrived in Penang. The Japanese never used the cannons because they were destroyed and incompatible with the strategy of deploying rapidly deployed naval and air defenses. Static defenses were useless in World War II. Furthermore, the site was too far from population centers and the Sukching processing center. The Japanese would not have wasted their time and fuel sending people that far just to kill them. There seems to be little real evidence to suggest that the Japanese ever used Batamang Fort. Even the Penang War Museum fails to display artifacts from the period. Visitors can explore the tunnels, barracks and bunkers used by the British, but the story of the Japanese occupation is told using a replica gallows, a replica guillotine and a large surreal mannequin.